The laughter cut through the ballroom like a blade, and every head turned toward the woman standing near the tall glass doors. "Still no match," Camille said loudly, raising her glass toward her cousin Alira Hartwell. "Darling, at this rate, even a duke wouldn't glance at you twice." The room erupted in soft chuckles. Some guests looked away in pity, others simply enjoyed the show. Alira stood still, her fingers tightening around the stem of her own glass, her face carefully blank. She had learned long ago that showing pain only fed the fire. What none of them knew, not even Camille, was that a man stood only a few steps behind Alira, close enough to hear every word. He wore a plain dark coat, no crest, no title pinned to his chest. To the crowd, he looked like any other guest who had wandered in from the cold. But his eyes, sharp and unreadable, had not moved from Camille since she opened her mouth. He said nothing, not yet. Alira set her glass down on a nearby table, her hand steady despite the heat rising in her chest. She turned, ready to slip away from the crowd, and found herself facing the stranger. For a moment, their eyes met. His gaze held no mockery, no pity, only a quiet, unreadable calm that unsettled her more than Camille's laughter ever could. "Excuse me," Alira murmured, stepping past him. He did not stop her. He simply watched her go, his jaw tightening as Camille's laughter continued to ring across the room behind her. Alira walked quickly through the crowd, past silk gowns and polished shoes, past whispered comments she pretended not to hear. She reached the terrace doors and stepped outside into the cool night air, letting it settle over her like a blanket. The party noise faded into a low hum behind the glass. She exhaled slowly, staring out at the dark garden below. It was not the first time Camille had humiliated her in public, and she doubted it would be the last. Ever since they were children, Camille had made a habit of comparing herself to Alira, always coming out ahead in her own mind, always needing an audience to confirm it. Alira's parents had died when she was young, leaving her in the care of her aunt and uncle, who never let her forget that she was a guest in their home, not a daughter. Camille, their only child, had grown up knowing she would inherit everything. Alira had grown up knowing she would inherit nothing but polite tolerance. She wrapped her arms around herself, the chill finally reaching her skin. Footsteps sounded behind her, unhurried, deliberate. She turned, expecting a servant come to call her back inside, but instead found the same stranger from before, standing a respectful distance away. "You handled that better than most people would," he said quietly. Alira blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't realize anyone was watching." "I was standing right behind you," he said. "It was hard not to notice." She studied him for a moment. His voice was calm, deep, carrying the kind of quiet confidence that came from a man used to being listened to, though he wore nothing to suggest wealth or rank. She wondered briefly if he was a merchant, or perhaps a guest attached to one of the other families. "It's kind of you to say something," she said, "but you didn't need to follow me out here." "I wasn't following you," he said, a faint trace of amusement in his voice. "I needed air as much as you did. That room gets crowded with more than just people." Despite herself, Alira felt the corner of her mouth lift slightly. That's one way to put it. They stood in silence for a moment, the distant sound of music drifting from inside. Alira found herself studying him again, trying to place his face among the guests she had been introduced to earlier that evening. She could not recall seeing him before Camille's outburst. "I don't think we've met," she said. "I'm Alira." "I know," he said simply. "Your cousin made sure the entire room knew your name tonight." A flush of embarrassment crept up her neck, but there was no mockery in his tone, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had happened. She appreciated that more than she expected to. "And you are?" she asked. He hesitated for the briefest moment, something flickering behind his eyes. "You can call me Alaric." No surname, no mention of family or estate. Alira did not press him for more. In her experience, people who avoided sharing details about themselves usually had reasons of their own, and she was not one to pry into another person's privacy, especially not after enduring years of others prying into hers. "Well, Alaric," she said, Thank you for the company, even if it was accidental. It wasn't entirely accidental, he admitted. Before she could ask what he meant, the terrace doors opened again, and Camille's voice carried out into the night air, sharp and searching. Elira, are you sulking out here again? Elira's shoulders stiffened. She turned to find her cousin standing in the doorway, golden hair catching the light from the ballroom behind her, a satisfied smile already forming on her lips as she spotted her cousin. Then her eyes landed on the man beside Elira, and her smile shifted into something more calculating. Oh, Camille said, stepping onto the terrace. I didn't realize you had company. Alaric said nothing, simply inclined his head politely toward Camille, giving no indication of who he was or why he had been speaking with Elira. Camille's eyes swept over him, taking in his plain coat, his unfamiliar face, clearly trying to determine whether he was someone worth her attention. I don't believe we've met, Camille said smoothly, extending her hand. I'm Camille Whitmore. This is my family's home. A pleasure, Alaric said, taking her hand briefly before releasing it. He offered no name in return. Camille's smile faltered slightly at his silence, unused to being brushed aside so easily. She turned back to Elira, her tone shifting to something falsely sweet. You really shouldn't keep guests to yourself out here in the cold, cousin. It's rude. I was just leaving, Elira said quietly, stepping past her cousin toward the doors. Wait, Alaric said. Elira paused, glancing back at him. Camille's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly unhappy at being ignored in favor of her cousin. Thank you for the conversation, Alaric said simply, his gaze steady on Elira. I hope we speak again. Elira nodded, unsure how to respond to the quiet sincerity in his voice, and slipped back into the ballroom, leaving Camille and Alaric alone on the terrace. She did not see the way Camille's expression shifted the moment she was gone, sizing up the stranger with fresh interest now that he had shown interest in someone else. So, Camille said, moving closer to him, are you here with one of the other families? I'm here as a guest, Alaric said simply. A mysterious guest, Camille said, smiling. I like that. Alaric said nothing, his attention already drifting toward the doors Elira had disappeared through. Camille continued talking, describing the party, her family's estate, the guests worth knowing, but he offered only brief, polite responses, his mind clearly elsewhere. Inside, Elira made her way through the crowd toward the staircase, hoping to reach her room without further incident. She had endured enough humiliation for one evening, and had no desire to remain among people who found her discomfort entertaining. Elira. She turned to find her aunt, Margaret Whitmore, approaching with a stern expression. Where are you going? The Ashfords haven't even arrived yet, and you're already trying to disappear. I have a headache, Elira said, which was not entirely a lie. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. You embarrassed this family enough tonight by storming off after Camille's little joke. Don't make it worse by vanishing before the important guests arrive. It wasn't a joke to laugh at, Aunt Margaret, Elira said quietly. Not to me. Camille didn't mean any harm, Margaret said dismissively. You take everything too seriously. Now go freshen up and come back down. We need every hand available tonight, and you know the staff are stretched thin. Elira swallowed her response and nodded, turning back toward the stairs. It was easier to comply than to argue, a lesson she had learned early in her years under this roof. She made her way to her small room on the upper floor, splashed cool water on her face, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. She did not see a woman deserving of mockery. She saw someone tired, someone who had spent years trying to make herself small enough not to be a burden, quiet enough not to draw attention, careful enough not to give anyone a reason to remind her of her place. And still, it was never enough. A soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find a young maid, Nora, holding a folded note. This came for you, miss, Nora said, glancing over her shoulder as though worried about being seen. A guest asked me to deliver it. Elira took the note, puzzled. Which guest? He didn't give a name, miss. Just said to make sure it reached you before the night was over. Nora hurried off before Alira could ask anything further. She closed the door and unfolded the note, her heart beating a little faster than she wanted to admit. The words were simple, written in a neat, confident hand. You deserve more respect than you received tonight. Not everyone in that room failed to notice your strength, even if they failed to acknowledge it aloud. There was no signature, but she did not need one. She knew immediately who had sent it. She sat on the edge of her bed, reading the note again, feeling something unfamiliar stir in her chest, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Hope, perhaps, or simply the relief of being seen, truly seen, by someone who owed her nothing and asked for nothing in return. Downstairs, the party continued without her, the music swelling as more guests arrived. Camille moved through the crowd, searching discreetly for the mysterious stranger who had slipped away from the terrace sometime during her conversation with him, leaving her mid-sentence without explanation. She told herself it did not matter, that plenty of eligible men attended these events, but something about his quiet composure had left an impression she could not quite shake. Near the entrance hall, Alaric stood speaking quietly with an older man in formal attire, a man who bowed his head slightly whenever Alaric spoke, a gesture too subtle for most guests to notice, but not unnoticed by everyone. Across the room, Lord Weston, an elderly guest with sharp eyes and a sharper memory, watched the exchange with quiet interest. He excused himself from his conversation and made his way toward Margaret Whitmore, who was busy directing servants near the refreshment table. "Margaret," he said quietly, "do you know who that gentleman is?" "The one by the entrance in the dark coat." Margaret glanced over, frowning slightly at the unfamiliar face. "I assumed he came with the Pembroke family. Why do you ask?" Lord Weston's expression remained thoughtful. "I could be mistaken, but something about him seems familiar. I'll need to look closer before I say more." Margaret dismissed the comment with a wave of her hand, too preoccupied with the evening's arrangements to give it further thought. She had no idea that the answer to Lord Weston's question would soon reshape everything she believed about her household, her daughter's prospects, and the niece she had spent years overlooking. Upstairs, Alira folded the note carefully and tucked it into the drawer of her nightstand, her heart still unsettled from the events of the evening. She had no way of knowing that the man who had sent it would return to her family's home again, this time under circumstances that would leave no room for hidden names or quiet anonymity. For now, she simply allowed herself a small, private smile, the first genuine one she had felt in longer than she could remember, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that perhaps she was not as invisible as her cousin liked to claim. Outside, the night deepened over the estate, carrying with it the quiet beginning of a story neither Alira nor Camille yet understood was already unfolding around them. 3 days after the party, a messenger arrived at the Whitmore estate carrying a formal letter sealed with dark blue wax. Margaret Whitmore tore it open at the breakfast table, her eyes scanning the contents quickly, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to open astonishment. "What is it?" Camille asked, setting down her cup of tea. "We are being asked to host a formal dinner," Margaret said slowly, "for a guest of considerable importance. The letter says he will be traveling through the region and wishes to stay with a respected local family for a few days before continuing his journey." "Which family sent the letter?" Camille asked, leaning forward with interest. Margaret glanced at the seal again, her fingers tracing the emblem pressed into the wax. "It doesn't say directly. Only that arrangements were made through Lord Weston, and that our household was recommended as suitable." Alira, seated quietly at the far end of the table, said nothing, though a small flicker of unease passed through her at the mention of Lord Weston, the same man who had been watching the mysterious stranger so closely at the party. "This could be an incredible opportunity," Margaret said, her voice rising with excitement. "If we host him well, it could open doors for this family that we've never had access to before." "Doors for me, you mean?" Camille said with a knowing smile. Margaret did not deny it. "Camille, this is exactly the kind of introduction we've been hoping for. A guest of importance, staying under our roof, dining at our table." You must be at your very best. Camille's eyes gleamed with anticipation. She had spent years attending parties and social gatherings, hoping to catch the attention of someone worth marrying, someone who could elevate her status beyond what her family already possessed. This felt, to her, like the opportunity she had been waiting for. "When does he arrive?" Camille asked. 2 days from now, Margaret said, already rising from her chair. "We have much to prepare. Elira, you'll need to help oversee the staff. The guest rooms must be spotless, the kitchen must be stocked for a proper dinner, and the household must look its absolute best." Elira nodded quietly, accustomed to being handed the practical responsibilities while Camille focused on herself. It did not bother her as much as it once had. She found a strange comfort in the work, in being useful, in having a clear task to focus on rather than the endless social games her aunt and cousin seemed to thrive on. Over the following 2 days, the estate transformed. Servants polished silver, arranged fresh flowers throughout the halls, and prepared the finest guest room the family owned. Elira moved quietly through the chaos, directing staff, checking linens, ensuring every detail was correct, all while Camille spent her time selecting gowns and practicing conversation topics she believed would impress their mysterious guest. On the evening of the dinner, Elira dressed in a simple pale blue gown, nothing as elaborate as Camille's deep emerald silk, but comfortable and neat. She had long since stopped trying to compete with her cousin in matters of appearance, focusing instead on being useful and unremarkable, safer positions within a household that valued her more for her labor than her presence. The carriage arrived precisely on time, its wheels crunching against the gravel drive as it pulled up to the front entrance. Margaret stood waiting at the door, Camille beside her, both dressed in their finest, eager to make the best possible impression. Elira remained a few steps behind, near the staff, ready to assist wherever needed. The carriage door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, dressed in dark formal attire, a long coat lined with subtle detailing that spoke of quality without excess. Elira's breath caught in her throat the moment she saw his face. It was Alaric. For a moment, their eyes met across the courtyard, and she saw the faintest flicker of recognition pass through his expression before he composed himself, his features settling into a polite, neutral calm befitting a formal introduction. "Welcome," Margaret said warmly, stepping forward. "We are honored to host you. I am Margaret Whitmore, and this is my daughter, Camille." "Thank you for your hospitality," Alaric said smoothly, inclining his head toward Margaret before turning slightly toward Camille. "It's a pleasure." Camille smiled brightly, clearly pleased by his attention, though she had no idea he was the same man she had spoken with on the terrace only days earlier. She had been too focused on impressing him then to remember many details of his appearance, distracted by his refusal to share his name. Margaret gestured toward Elira, who stood quietly near the entrance. "And this is my niece, Elira. She helps manage the household." Alaric's eyes shifted toward Elira, and for a brief moment something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement neither could voice in front of the others. "A pleasure," he said simply, his tone giving nothing away. "Please come inside," Margaret said, already turning toward the door. "Dinner will be served shortly." The evening progressed with careful formality. The dining room glowed with candlelight, the table set with the family's finest china, every dish prepared with meticulous care. Camille sat beside their guest, engaging him in conversation about local society, recent events, and topics she believed would highlight her wit and charm. Alaric responded politely, offering brief answers, his attention occasionally drifting toward Elira, who sat near the far end of the table, quietly overseeing the service of each course, ensuring the evening ran smoothly. "You must tell us about your travels," Camille said, leaning slightly closer. "A man of your bearing surely has fascinating stories." "I've seen a fair amount of the country," Alaric said carefully, "though I find quiet evenings like this just as interesting as grand journeys." "How modest," Camille said with a small laugh. "I imagine someone like you has far more exciting tales than dinner conversation." Alira, overhearing the exchange as she directed a servant to refill water glasses, kept her expression neutral, though she could not help but notice how carefully Alaric avoided revealing anything specific about himself, deflecting each question with practiced ease. After dinner, the group moved to the drawing room, where Margaret insisted on a round of quiet conversation before retiring for the evening. Camille positioned herself near Alaric, continuing her efforts to capture his attention, while Alira busied herself arranging refreshments near the sideboard. "Alira," Margaret said suddenly, "why don't you play something for our guest? You know how skilled she is at the piano," she added, turning toward Alaric with a proud smile that felt more performative than genuine. Alira froze slightly, unused to being included in such moments. "I wouldn't want to intrude on the conversation." "Nonsense," Margaret said. "Go on." Reluctantly, Alira moved to the piano positioned near the window, taking a seat and allowing her fingers to settle over the keys. She began to play a quiet, familiar piece, one she had practiced countless times alone in the early mornings when the household was still asleep. The music filled the room, gentle and unhurried, drawing quiet attention from everyone present. Alaric watched her closely as she played, something softening in his expression that had nothing to do with polite obligation. Camille, noticing his attention had shifted entirely away from her, felt a flicker of irritation she quickly masked with a pleasant smile. When the piece ended, a brief silence settled over the room before Margaret clapped politely. "Lovely, as always." "That was beautifully done," Alaric said quietly, his eyes still on Alira. "Thank you," she said softly, rising from the piano bench, unsure how to respond to the sincerity in his voice. The evening eventually drew to a close, guests retiring to their rooms, servants clearing the remaining dishes. Alira remained downstairs a while longer, ensuring everything was in order before the household settled for the night. As she moved through the quiet hallway near the guest wing, she nearly collided with Alaric, who had stepped out of his room for a breath of air. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon," she said, startled. "Nor I," he admitted. "Though I suppose I should apologize for the confusion. I didn't intend to deceive you at the party." "You didn't give me your surname," Alira said carefully. "I assumed you simply preferred privacy." "It's complicated," he said, glancing down the hallway as though weighing how much to share. "There are reasons I don't always announce myself upon arrival." "You don't owe me an explanation," Alira said gently. "We only spoke briefly." "I'd like to speak with you again," he said, his voice quieter now. "If you're willing." Alira hesitated, aware of how unusual this entire situation felt, a guest of clear importance seeking out conversation with the household's overlooked niece, rather than the daughter positioned so eagerly to win his attention. "I don't think that would be appropriate, given the circumstances." "Because of your aunt's expectations?" he asked. "Because of everyone's expectations," she said honestly, "including my own most days." Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of understanding passing behind his eyes. "Then, perhaps we simply enjoy quiet conversation now and then, without expectation attached to it." Alira studied him for a long moment, weighing the risk of allowing herself even this small connection. "Perhaps," she said finally, a faint smile touching her lips before she continued down the hallway, leaving him standing alone in the dim light. The following morning, Camille descended the stairs early, determined to secure breakfast alone with their guest before anyone else could interrupt. She found the dining room empty, save for a servant setting the table, and frowned in frustration. "Where is our guest?" she asked. "He requested a walk through the garden this morning, miss," the servant replied. "He mentioned needing fresh air before breakfast." Camille made her way toward the garden, hoping to intercept him, only to stop short at the sight that greeted her through the hedges. Alaric stood near the fountain, deep in quiet conversation with Alira, who had apparently been sent to gather fresh flowers for the morning table. Their heads were bent slightly toward one another, an easy comfort visible in their posture that made Camille's stomach twist with something uncomfortably close to jealousy. She straightened her shoulders and stepped forward, forcing a bright smile onto her face. "Good morning," she called out, her voice carrying across the garden. Both Alira and Alaric turned at the sound, the easy comfort between them shifting immediately into polite formality as Camille approached, her eyes flicking between the two of them with poorly concealed suspicion. "Alira, shouldn't you be helping in the kitchen this morning?" Camille asked pointedly. "I was just finishing," Alira said calmly, holding up the small basket of flowers she had gathered. "I'll take these inside now." She offered a brief nod toward Alaric before making her way back toward the house, leaving Camille alone with their guest. Camille watched her cousin retreat before turning her attention fully toward Alaric, determined to reclaim the morning for herself. "I hope she wasn't bothering you," Camille said lightly. "She tends to wander where she isn't needed." "She wasn't bothering me at all," Alaric said, his tone carrying a subtle edge Camille failed to notice. "I asked her a question about the garden, and she was kind enough to answer." "How thoughtful of her," Camille said, though her smile had grown noticeably tighter. "Shall we walk together? I'd love to show you the rest of the grounds." Alaric agreed politely. Though his gaze lingered briefly on the doorway, Alira had disappeared through before he turned his attention to Camille, allowing her to lead the way through the garden paths, her voice filling the morning air with practiced charm that felt, to him, increasingly hollow compared to the quiet honesty he had found in her cousin. Inside, Alira arranged the flowers in a vase near the dining room window, her thoughts still lingering on the conversation she had shared with Alaric only minutes earlier. He had asked about her life, her interests, the small details most people never bothered to notice about her, and she had found herself answering more openly than she intended, drawn in by the sincerity in his questions. She reminded herself firmly that he was a guest passing through, a man of clear importance who would soon continue his journey, leaving her household behind entirely. Whatever brief connection they shared meant little in the grand scope of her circumstances. And yet, as she placed the final flower into the vase, she could not entirely shake the warmth that had settled over her during their quiet exchange by the fountain, nor the growing curiosity about who, exactly, this guest truly was. Over the following days, Alaric's visit extended longer than anyone had originally expected. What was meant to be a short stay of 2 or 3 nights stretched into a full week, with no clear explanation offered beyond vague mentions of delayed travel arrangements. Margaret welcomed the extended stay eagerly, seeing it as further opportunity for Camille to secure his attention, while Camille herself grew increasingly determined to make the most of every remaining moment. Alira, for her part, tried to maintain distance, aware of how easily rumors could spread within a household already inclined to scrutinize her every move. But circumstances continued to draw her and Alaric into each other's paths, whether through household duties, quiet mornings in the garden, or brief exchanges in hallways when no one else was near. One afternoon, Margaret organized a small gathering of neighboring families, eager to showcase their distinguished guest to the wider social circle. The drawing room filled with familiar faces, including Lord Weston, who arrived with his usual sharp, observant gaze, along with Lady Priscilla Ashford, a longtime friend of Margaret's known for her keen interest in local gossip. As the gathering settled into polite conversation, Lord Weston made his way toward Alaric, his expression carrying a quiet knowingness that Alaric recognized immediately. "It's been some time," Lord Weston said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that only Alaric could hear. "I wasn't certain you'd allow me to keep your secret this long." "I appreciate your discretion," Alaric replied evenly, "though I imagine it won't last much longer." "No," Lord Weston agreed, glancing briefly toward Margaret and Camille, who stood nearby, unaware of the exchange taking place only a few steps away. "These things rarely do." Alira, moving quietly through the room with a tray of refreshments, caught only fragments of their conversation, not enough to understand its meaning, but enough to notice the weight behind their words. She continued her task, offering drinks to the seated guests, careful not to draw attention to herself. Lady Priscilla, seated near the center of the room, watched Alira's movements with open curiosity. "Margaret, dear, is this the niece I've heard mentioned once or twice? She's rather lovely, isn't she?" Margaret's smile tightened slightly. "She helps around the household. Very useful, though not particularly suited for society." "Nonsense," Lady Priscilla said, studying Alira with renewed interest. "A woman doesn't need loud charm to be suited for society. Sometimes the quiet ones are the most interesting." Camille, overhearing the comment, quickly redirected the conversation. "Alira prefers staying out of the spotlight. She's much happier managing the household than attending social events." "Is that so?" Lady Priscilla asked, glancing toward Alira, who had paused near the doorway, uncertain whether to remain or excuse herself. "I'm quite content, thank you," Alira said politely, offering a small, practiced smile before stepping out of the room entirely, eager to escape the sudden attention. Alaric, who had been listening to the exchange from across the room, felt a familiar tightness settle in his chest at the dismissive way Camille spoke about her cousin, the ease with which she diminished Alira's presence in front of guests without a hint of guilt. He excused himself from his current conversation and made his way toward the hallway Alira had disappeared into. He found her standing near a window overlooking the garden, her arms crossed loosely as she stared out at the fading afternoon light. "You handled that gracefully," he said quietly, stepping beside her. "I've had practice," Alira replied, a faint edge of tiredness in her voice. "You shouldn't have to," he said. "Practice being dismissed, I mean." Alira turned to look at him, surprised by the quiet intensity in his tone. "It's simply how things are in this household. I stopped expecting anything different a long time ago." "That doesn't mean it's right," he said. She studied him for a long moment, unsure how to respond to the sincerity behind his words. "You speak as though you understand what it's like to be overlooked. Somehow, I doubt that's true for someone like you." Something flickered across his expression, a shadow of old memories he chose not to elaborate on. "Everyone carries burdens others don't see, Alira. Mine simply look different from yours." Before she could ask what he meant, footsteps echoed down the hallway and Camille appeared, her eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of them standing together once again. "There you are," Camille said, directing her attention toward Alaric. "Lady Priscilla was hoping to speak with you further about your travels." "Of course," Alaric said smoothly, though his eyes lingered briefly on Alira before he followed Camille back toward the drawing room, leaving Alira alone with her thoughts once more. That evening, after the guests had departed and the household began settling for the night, Alira found herself unable to sleep, her mind replaying the conversation from earlier. She rose from her bed and made her way toward the small library on the ground floor, hoping a quiet book might help ease her restless thoughts. She found the library already occupied. Alaric sat near the fireplace, a book resting unopened in his lap, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, glancing up as she entered. "I didn't mean to intrude," Alira said, already turning to leave. "You're not intruding," he said. "Please stay if you'd like." She hesitated only a moment before stepping further into the room, settling into the chair across from him, the warmth of the fire filling the quiet space between them. "You mentioned earlier that everyone carries burdens others don't see," Alira said carefully. "What did you mean by that?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to share. "I've spent a great deal of my life being defined by expectations I never chose for myself. People see a title, or a name, or a reputation, and they assume they understand who I am because of it. Very few take the time to look beyond that." "That sounds lonely," Alira said softly. "It can be," he admitted. "Which is part of why I've enjoyed our conversations. You don't seem interested in who I am beyond what I choose to share." "I suppose I understand what it's like to be reduced to a single idea in someone else's mind," Alira said. "For years, I've simply been the niece who wasn't fortunate enough to be born into wealth, the cousin who doesn't quite measure up. It's difficult to be seen as anything more than that within these walls." "I see more than that," Alaric said quietly. Alira looked up at him, something warm and uncertain stirring in her chest at the quiet sincerity in his voice. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you play the piano beautifully, though you rarely allow yourself the chance to enjoy it. I know you manage this entire household with quiet competence, even though you receive little credit for it. And I know you handled public humiliation with more grace than most people could manage in a lifetime." Alira felt her cheeks warm at his words, unsure how to respond to being seen so clearly by someone she had known for such a short time. "You're very observant." "I've had reason to be," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. They continued talking long into the night, the conversation drifting easily between quiet topics, neither willing to bring the evening to a close despite the late hour. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Alira felt entirely comfortable simply being herself, without the constant need to shrink herself smaller to avoid drawing attention. As the fire began to die down, Alaric finally rose from his chair, glancing toward the window where the first hints of dawn were beginning to color the sky. "I should let you rest, though I confess, I've enjoyed this evening more than I expected to." "As have I," Alira admitted, rising as well. He walked her to the library door, pausing before she stepped into the hallway. "Alira, there's something I should tell you, about who I am." Her heart quickened slightly at the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from further down the hallway, followed by the soft glow of a candle carried by one of the household servants making early morning rounds. Alaric hesitated, glancing toward the approaching light. "Another time," he said quietly, though something in his expression suggested reluctance to let the moment pass. "I promise I'll explain everything soon." Alira nodded, though a small knot of uncertainty settled in her stomach as she made her way back toward her room, wondering what exactly he had been about to reveal, and why the timing of the interruption felt, somehow, like more than simple coincidence. The following days carried a new weight between them, an unspoken awareness that something important remained unsaid. Alira found herself watching Alaric more closely during shared meals and quiet moments in the household, searching for clues about the truth he had almost shared, while he, in turn, seemed increasingly distracted, caught between his growing feelings for her and the complicated reality of his position. Meanwhile, Camille's frustration grew with each passing day, sensing a shift in Alaric's attention that she could not quite explain, but felt nonetheless. She began watching Alira and Alaric more closely, noting the quiet glances exchanged across rooms, the way conversations seemed to pause slightly whenever the two of them found themselves near one another. One evening, as the household prepared for a small dinner marking the final days of Alaric's extended stay, Camille cornered her cousin in the hallway outside the kitchen, her expression sharp with suspicion. "What exactly is going on between you and our guest?" Camille demanded, her voice low but tense. "Nothing is going on," Alira said carefully. "We've simply spoken a few times." "You expect me to believe that?" Camille said. "I've seen the way he looks at you, the way you look at him." "You're imagining things," Alira said, though her voice lacked full conviction. Camille's eyes narrowed. "I've spent months trying to secure his attention, and you've managed to distract him within days without even trying. Do you understand what an opportunity like this means for this family?" "I understand you see him as an opportunity," Alira said quietly. "I'm not certain that's the same as understanding him as a person." Camille's expression darkened further. "Careful, cousin. You have far more to lose in this household than I do. Don't forget that." She turned and stormed off toward the dining room, leaving Alira standing alone in the hallway, the weight of the unspoken threat settling heavily over her. She knew Camille well enough to understand that her cousin rarely made idle warnings, and the uncertainty of what might come next left her stomach twisted with quiet dread. Later that evening, as dinner concluded and guests began retiring for the night, Alira found herself once again drawn toward the garden, seeking a moment of solitude to steady her thoughts. She had not expected to find Alaric already there, standing near the fountain, his expression thoughtful as he stared up at the night sky. "You seem troubled," he said, noticing her approach. "It's nothing," she said, though the tension in her voice betrayed her. "Alira," he said gently, "you can tell me." She hesitated, weighing whether to share Camille's warning before deciding against it, unwilling to create further conflict within an already fragile household dynamic. "I'm simply tired. It's been a long week." He studied her for a long moment, clearly sensing there was more beneath her words, but chose not to press further. "I leave in 3 days," he said instead, "though I find myself reluctant to go." Alira's chest tightened at the mention of his departure, an ache she had not fully allowed herself to acknowledge until that moment. "I imagine you have important matters awaiting you elsewhere." "I do," he admitted, "though none of them feel as important as finishing our conversation from the other night." Her heart skipped at the reminder of his unfinished confession. "You still haven't told me who you truly are." "No," he agreed quietly, "but I will before I leave, I promise you that." They stood together in comfortable silence beneath the night sky, neither quite ready to end the moment, both aware that time was slipping quickly toward an uncertain future neither fully understood yet, though both sensed, deep down, that whatever truth Alaric carried would change everything between them once it finally came to light. 2 days passed quickly, each one carrying its own quiet tension. Alira found herself watching the calendar with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation, aware that Alaric's promised explanation was drawing closer, though she still had no idea what shape it would take. She told herself repeatedly that whatever he revealed would not change how she felt about their conversations, their quiet understanding, the comfort she had found in his presence. But a small, nervous voice in the back of her mind warned her that some truths carried consequences too large to simply wish away. Camille, meanwhile, had grown noticeably colder toward her cousin, offering only clipped responses whenever their paths crossed, her earlier warning hanging unspoken but ever present between them. Margaret, oblivious to the tension building beneath her roof, continued planning a final farewell dinner to properly send off their distinguished guest, determined to leave a lasting impression before his departure. On the morning of the second day, Alira was summoned to the drawing room by her aunt, who greeted her with an unusually serious expression. "Sit down, Alira," Margaret said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. Alira obeyed, though unease settled in her stomach at her aunt's tone. "Is something wrong?" "I need you to be honest with me," Margaret said carefully. "Has our guest shown you any particular attention during his stay?" Alira's heart skipped, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "We've spoken a few times, Aunt Margaret." "Nothing more?" Margaret studied her closely, clearly searching for any sign of deception. "Camille believes there may be more to it than simple conversation." "Camille tends to see rivals where none exist," Alira said quietly, though guilt tugged faintly at her conscience for the half-truth. Margaret's expression remained skeptical, but she did not press further. "Regardless, I expect you to remain focused on your duties for the remainder of his stay. This family's future depends on making the right impression, and I won't have anything interfere with Camille's prospects." "Understood," Alira said, though the words tasted bitter as she spoke them. She left the drawing room with a heavy heart, the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her once again. It was a familiar feeling, the reminder that her own happiness would always come second to Camille's opportunities, that her role within the household was to support, not to hope for anything of her own. Later that afternoon, while gathering linens in the guest wing, Alira nearly collided with Alaric as he stepped out of his room, his expression immediately softening at the sight of her, though something troubled lingered behind his eyes as well. "I've been looking for you," he said quietly. "I've been busy," Alira admitted, though she made no move to leave. He glanced down the hallway, ensuring they were alone before speaking again. "I received word this morning. I'll need to depart tomorrow instead of the day after." Alira's chest tightened at the sudden shift in timeline. "So soon?" "I'm afraid so," he said, which means whatever I need to tell you, I should tell you tonight. A nervous flutter settled in her stomach. Tonight, then. Meet me in the garden after the household retires, he said. Please. She nodded, though uncertainty churned within her as she watched him disappear down the hallway, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts for the remainder of the afternoon. The farewell dinner that evening carried an air of forced celebration, Margaret ensuring every detail was perfect, Camille dressed in her finest gown, determined to make one final impression before their guest departed. Alira moved quietly through her usual duties, though her mind remained entirely consumed by the promise of their planned meeting later that night. Throughout dinner, Camille monopolized much of the conversation, recounting stories designed to highlight her wit and charm, while Alaric offered polite responses, his attention occasionally drifting toward Alira despite his best efforts to remain focused on his hostess. You'll have to visit again soon, Camille said as dinner concluded, her tone carrying obvious hope. Our household would welcome you back any time. You're very kind, Alaric said diplomatically, offering no direct promise of return. As the evening wound down and guests began retiring for the night, Alira ensured the household settled into its usual quiet rhythm, before slipping out toward the garden, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and nervous uncertainty. She found Alaric already waiting near the fountain, moonlight casting soft shadows across the quiet grounds. You came, he said, relief evident in his voice. You said it was important, Alira replied, moving closer. He was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts before finally speaking. Alira, the name I gave you when we first met, Alaric, it is my name, but it isn't the whole truth of who I am. Her heart quickened, though she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. I am Duke Alaric Kane, he said finally, watching her closely for her reaction. The words settled over her slowly, the weight of them taking a moment to fully register. She had heard the name before, whispered occasionally among the household staff, and mentioned briefly by guests at various gatherings, always spoken with a mixture of respect and caution. Duke Alaric Kane was known throughout the region as a reclusive nobleman, powerful and influential, rarely seen in public society, his reputation carrying an air of intimidation that kept most from approaching him directly. You're the Duke everyone speaks of, she said slowly, piecing the truth together. The one people fear. I've heard that description before, he said, a faint trace of weariness in his voice, though I've never sought fear as a reputation. It simply grew from distance and unfamiliarity, from people assuming the worst about someone they've never truly met. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Alira asked, though there was no anger in her voice, only genuine confusion. Because the moment people learn my title, everything changes, he said quietly. Conversations become calculated, kindness becomes strategy. I wanted just once to be seen as simply a man without the weight of my title shaping every interaction, and with you, that finally happened. Alira absorbed his words carefully, understanding slowly settling over her. That's why you didn't correct Camille when she assumed you were simply a guest, why you avoided giving your surname at the party. Yes, he admitted. Though I never intended to deceive you specifically, not once I realized how genuine our conversations had become. This changes things, Alira said softly, stepping back slightly, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in understanding. Does it have to? Alaric asked, closing the distance she had created. You're a duke, she said. I'm a niece with no inheritance, no title, no standing within society beyond managing my aunt's household. Whatever this is between us, it can't lead anywhere realistic. I don't believe standing determines worth, Alaric said firmly. I've spent my life surrounded by people who value title and wealth above genuine character, and I've grown tired of it. You've shown me more honesty and warmth in the past week than most people manage in years of acquaintance. Alira felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, moved by the sincerity in his words, though fear still gripped her chest at the enormity of what he was suggesting. Your family, your position, Surely there are expectations placed on who you might consider marrying. There are, he admitted, which is exactly why I've avoided serious consideration of marriage until now. I refuse to bind myself to someone chosen purely for political or social advantage. And if your family objects to someone like me, Alira asked quietly, then they'll simply have to understand that my happiness matters more to me than their expectations, he said firmly. The certainty in his voice steadied something within her, though the weight of the situation still felt overwhelming. I need time to process this, she said honestly. This is a great deal to take in. Of course, Alaric said gently. I don't expect an answer tonight. I only wanted you to know the truth before I departed, whatever you choose to do with it. They stood together in silence for a long moment, the quiet night air settling around them as Alira allowed herself to fully absorb the reality of what she had just learned. Finally, she spoke again, her voice steadier than before. Thank you for trusting me with the truth, she said, even if I'm still uncertain what it means for either of us. That's all I ask, Alaric said, offering a gentle smile. Trust, honesty, and whatever time you need. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his, a simple gesture that carried more warmth and sincerity than any grand declaration could have offered. Alira allowed the contact, comforted by the steadiness of his presence despite the uncertainty swirling within her. I depart early tomorrow morning, he said softly, but I intend to write to you if you'll allow it. I'd like that, Alira said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. They remained together a while longer, the conversation shifting toward lighter topics, though the weight of his revelation lingered beneath every word exchanged. Eventually, the late hour demanded they part ways, Alaric walking her back toward the house before bidding her a quiet, meaningful good night. Alira returned to her room in a daze, her mind spinning with the events of the evening. She sat by her window for a long while, staring out at the moonlit garden, replaying every word of their conversation, still struggling to fully comprehend the reality that the man she had grown so fond of was, in fact, the very Duke her family and cousin had long spoken of with a mixture of admiration and fear. The following morning arrived quickly, the household stirring early to see their distinguished guest off before his departure. Margaret and Camille stood at the entrance, offering polite farewells, Camille clearly hoping for some final indication of continued interest, though Alaric's attention remained carefully measured, offering warmth without particular favor toward anyone present, save for a brief, meaningful glance toward Alira, who stood quietly near the staff, her heart heavy with the weight of unspoken understanding between them. As his carriage pulled away from the estate, disappearing down the long gravel drive, Camille turned toward her cousin with a satisfied smile, unaware of the truth that had unfolded between them the night before. Well, Camille said lightly, I suppose that's the end of that excitement. Back to ordinary days, I imagine. Alira said nothing, watching the carriage disappear into the distance, her thoughts consumed entirely by the promise of letters yet to come, and the uncertain future that now stretched before her, forever changed by the truth she now carried. The weeks that followed settled into a strange new rhythm. Life within the Whitmore household continued much as it always had, filled with Margaret's endless social planning and Camille's persistent efforts to secure a favorable match among the region's eligible gentlemen. Yet for Alira, everything felt subtly different, colored by the secret she now carried and the quiet anticipation that accompanied each passing day. True to his word, Alaric began writing to her within the first week of his departure. His letters arrived discreetly, delivered through Nora, the young maid who had proven herself trustworthy enough to handle the delicate arrangement without drawing attention from the rest of the household. Each letter carried thoughtful observations about his travels, gentle questions about her days, and small admissions of how much he missed their quiet conversations. Alira treasured every letter, reading them repeatedly before carefully hiding them away in the drawer of her nightstand, alongside the very first note he had sent her the night of Camille's public mockery. She responded with equal care, sharing small details of her days, her thoughts, her growing sense of hope for a future she had never before allowed herself to imagine. Despite the joy these letters brought her, Alira remained cautious, aware of how quickly circumstances could shift within her household, and mindful of Camille's earlier warning. She kept her correspondence carefully hidden, never mentioning Alaric's name aloud, never allowing her expression to betray the quiet happiness building within her whenever a new letter arrived. One afternoon, nearly a month after Alaric's departure, Margaret called a family meeting in the drawing room, her expression carrying the particular excitement she reserved for matters of significant social importance. "I have wonderful news," Margaret announced, settling into her favorite chair. "Lord Weston has extended an invitation for our family to attend a gathering at his estate next month. It seems several distinguished families will be in attendance, including some connections to nobility." Camille's eyes lit up immediately. Nobility, which families specifically? "Lord Weston wasn't entirely clear," Margaret admitted, though he mentioned it would be an excellent opportunity to expand our social connections. "This is precisely the kind of event we should prepare thoroughly for." Alira listened quietly from her usual position near the edge of the room, wondering silently whether Alaric might be among the guests Lord Weston referred to, given the clear familiarity between the two men she had witnessed during his stay. "Alira, you'll assist with preparations as usual," Margaret continued, barely glancing in her direction. "Though I expect you to remain in the background during the actual gathering, this event is far too important for any distractions." The comment stung slightly, though Alira had grown accustomed to such dismissals over the years. She nodded quietly, accepting her role without protest, though a small part of her wondered how much longer she could continue accepting such treatment now that she carried a secret that, if revealed, would upend everything her aunt believed about the household hierarchy. As preparations for the gathering began, Camille's excitement grew increasingly intense, convinced that this event might finally secure the advantageous match she had been seeking for years. She spent considerable time selecting gowns, practicing conversation topics, and speculating about which noble families might be in attendance. Meanwhile, Alira continued exchanging letters with Alaric, their correspondence growing steadily warmer with each exchange. In his most recent letter, he had mentioned attending to some pressing matters at his estate before making plans to visit the region again, though he offered no specific timeline, careful not to raise expectations he could not guarantee fulfilling. One evening, while helping Nora deliver fresh linens to the guest wing, Alira found herself alone in the hallway when Lord Weston, visiting briefly to finalize details for the upcoming gathering, approached her with a knowing smile. "Miss Hartwell," he said warmly, "I hope you're keeping well." "Quite well, thank you, Lord Weston," Alira replied politely, though she felt a flicker of nervousness at his sudden attention. "I understand you've become acquainted with a certain gentleman during his recent stay here," Lord Weston said carefully, his tone gentle but knowing. Alira's heart skipped, uncertain how much he knew or suspected. "I'm not certain what you mean, my lord." "You needn't worry," he said kindly, lowering his voice further. "I've known Alaric since he was a young boy. I recognized the particular way he looked at you during his visit, a look I haven't seen from him in quite some time. He's a good man, Alira, despite the reputation others have built around him out of misunderstanding and distance." Alira felt a rush of relief at his understanding, though caution still tempered her response. "I appreciate you saying so, my lord, though our circumstances remain complicated." "Complications have a way of resolving themselves when the people involved are determined enough," Lord Weston said with a knowing smile. "I simply wanted you to know you have an ally should you ever need one within these social circles." "Thank you," Alira said sincerely, touched by his unexpected kindness. Lord Weston nodded and continued down the hallway, leaving Alira with a renewed sense of hope, comforted by the knowledge that at least one person within her family's social circle understood and supported the unlikely connection forming between her and the Duke. As the weeks progressed toward the gathering at Lord Weston's estate, Tension within the Whitmore household grew increasingly palpable. Camille's anxiety about securing a favorable match intensified, leading to increasingly sharp comments directed toward her cousin whenever she felt Alira was receiving undue attention from anyone, staff or otherwise. One particular afternoon, Camille discovered Alira reading quietly in the small library, a stack of correspondence resting on the table beside her. Though Alira quickly gathered the letters upon hearing her cousin's approach, Camille's sharp eyes caught sight of the unfamiliar handwriting before she could fully conceal them. "What are those?" Camille asked, her tone immediately suspicious. "Nothing important," Alira said quickly, tucking the letters into her book. "They looked important enough for you to hide them the moment I entered," Camille pressed, moving closer. "Their personal correspondence, Camille," Alira said firmly, standing her ground despite her racing heart. "Everyone is entitled to some privacy." Camille's eyes narrowed, studying her cousin with growing suspicion. "Who exactly are you corresponding with, Alira? You have no acquaintances outside this household, no connections of your own. Unless, of course, someone has taken a particular interest in you recently." "It's none of your concern," Alira said, gathering her things and moving toward the door, eager to escape further questioning. "It becomes my concern," Camille called after her, "if it involves someone who should rightfully be focused on securing this family's future, rather than wasting attention on a niece with nothing to offer." Alira did not respond, hurrying from the room with her heart pounding, uncertain how much longer she could keep her secret hidden within a household so determined to uncover it. She retreated to her room, carefully securing her letters within their usual hiding place, though the encounter left her deeply unsettled, aware that Camille's suspicions were growing sharper with each passing week. That evening, as Alira prepared for bed, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it cautiously to find Nora standing outside, her expression anxious. "Miss Alira," Nora whispered, "I think Miss Camille has been asking questions among the staff. She wanted to know if anyone has been delivering unusual correspondence to you." Alira's stomach tightened with worry. "Did you tell her anything?" "Of course not, miss," Nora said quickly. "But I fear she suspects something. You should be careful." "Thank you for warning me, Nora," Alira said gratefully. "I'll be more cautious going forward." Nora nodded and slipped away quietly, leaving Alira alone with her mounting anxiety. She sat at her desk and penned a careful letter to Alaric, explaining the growing suspicion within her household and expressing concern about how much longer their correspondence could remain hidden without consequence. His response arrived a few days later, carrying words of reassurance alongside a promise that mattered more than he could have known. He explained that he intended to visit the region again soon, this time under circumstances that would allow him to formally reveal his intentions toward her, rather than continuing to hide behind secrecy that only invited further suspicion and risk. Alira read his words with a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety, aware that whatever revelation he planned would inevitably upend the careful balance she had maintained within her household for years. She understood that once the truth came to light, there would be no returning to the quiet, overlooked existence she had grown accustomed to, for better or worse. As the day of Lord Weston's gathering approached, Alira found herself caught between hope and dread, uncertain what the coming weeks would bring, but increasingly aware that the quiet secret she had carried since that fateful night at the terrace was drawing closer to an inevitable and irreversible reveal. Camille's suspicion did not fade with time. Instead, it hardened into quiet determination, a resolve to uncover exactly what her cousin had been hiding. She began watching Alira more closely than ever, noting the small moments of distraction, the faint smile that occasionally crossed her cousin's face when she believed no one was looking, the careful way she guarded her personal belongings. One morning, while Alira assisted with errands in the nearby village, Camille seized the opportunity to search her cousin's room, driven by a mixture of curiosity and growing resentment. She moved carefully through Alira's modest belongings, searching for any clue that might explain the recent change in her cousin's behavior. Her search led her to the nightstand drawer, where she discovered the small bundle of letters Alira had so carefully hidden. Camille's hands trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon holding them together. Her eyes scanning the elegant handwriting, she recognized immediately from the seal pressed into several of the envelopes. The truth hit her like a physical blow. The letters were signed simply as Alaric, but the wax seal stamped onto several envelopes bore an unmistakable crest, one she had seen before on formal documents delivered to Lord Weston's estate. Duke Alaric Kane. Camille sat frozen for several long minutes, the weight of the revelation settling over her with crushing force. The mysterious guest she had spent weeks trying to impress, the man she had hoped might secure her family's future through advantageous marriage, had been writing secret letters to her overlooked cousin the entire time. Anger and humiliation churned within her, twisting into something far more dangerous than simple jealousy. She carefully retied the ribbon around the letters, returning them to their hiding place, determined not to reveal her discovery immediately. Instead, she began formulating a plan, one designed to ensure that whatever connection existed between Alira and the Duke would be destroyed before it could threaten her own carefully laid plans. Over the following days, Camille's demeanor shifted subtly, her hostility toward Alira masked beneath a veneer of forced politeness that unsettled Alira more than open hostility ever could. She sensed something had changed, though she had no way of knowing her secret had already been discovered. The night before the gathering at Lord Weston's estate, Camille approached her mother privately, her expression carefully arranged to convey concern rather than malice. "Mother," she said quietly, "I need to speak with you about something troubling." "What is it, dear?" Margaret asked, setting aside the guest list she had been reviewing. "I discovered something recently that I believe you should know," Camille said carefully. "Alira has been receiving secret correspondence, hidden away in her room. I believe she's been engaged in some sort of improper relationship." Margaret's expression shifted to immediate concern. "Improper how?" "I don't know all the details," Camille said, choosing her words carefully to plant doubt without revealing the full truth she had uncovered. "But the letters suggest a man of some importance has been writing to her, secretly, without our knowledge or approval. Given her position within this household, and the fact that she has no proper standing to be entertaining suitors of importance, I worry she may be attempting to deceive someone, or worse, damage this family's reputation through some scandal." Margaret's face hardened with anger. "This is precisely the kind of behavior I feared when we took her in all those years ago. After everything this family has provided her, she repays us by risking scandal through secret dealings we know nothing about." "I thought you should know before tomorrow's gathering," Camille said, feigning reluctant concern. "I wouldn't want anything to interfere with the important connections we're hoping to make." "You did the right thing telling me," Margaret said firmly. "I'll deal with this immediately." That evening, Margaret confronted Alira in the privacy of the drawing room, her expression cold with barely contained anger. "I understand you've been receiving secret correspondence." Alira's stomach dropped, immediately understanding that her hidden letters had somehow been discovered. "Aunt Margaret, I can explain." "I don't wish to hear excuses," Margaret said sharply. "I want to know who you've been corresponding with and why you felt the need to hide it from this family." Alira hesitated, torn between protecting the truth Alaric had entrusted her with and defending herself against her aunt's growing anger. "It's someone I met during his visit here," she said carefully. "Someone respectable, I promise you." "If he's respectable, why the secrecy?" Margaret demanded. "Why hide letters rather than simply informing this family of a legitimate courtship?" "Because our circumstances are complicated," Alira said, her voice trembling slightly under the weight of her aunt's scrutiny. "Complicated how?" Margaret pressed. "Is he already married, involved with someone else?" "Alira, if you've allowed yourself to be entangled in some inappropriate situation, you risk not only your own reputation, but this entire family's standing within society." "It's nothing improper," Alira insisted, though she stopped short of revealing Alaric's true identity, uncertain whether doing so would help or worsen her situation given her aunt's current state of anger. Margaret studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced. "I forbid any further correspondence until you're willing to be honest with this family about who exactly you've been writing to. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Aunt Margaret," Alira said quietly, though inwardly she felt a rising sense of desperation at the thought of losing her connection to Alaric entirely. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, "you will remain here tomorrow rather than attending Lord Weston's gathering. I won't risk whatever scandal you've entangled yourself in interfering with Camille's opportunities." The word struck Alira like a physical blow, though she had little choice but to accept her aunt's decision. "As you wish," she said softly, retreating from the drawing room with tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. That night, alone in her room, Alira penned a hurried letter to Alaric, explaining the situation as carefully as she could without revealing too much detail, uncertain whether her letter would even reach him given her aunt's new restrictions. She entrusted it to Nora, who promised to find a way to deliver it discreetly before the household's restrictions tightened further. The following morning arrived with a heavy, tense atmosphere throughout the household. Margaret and Camille prepared for their departure to Lord Weston's gathering, dressed in their finest attire, while Alira remained behind, confined to her usual household duties, her heart aching with worry over how the situation might unfold in her absence. As the carriage carrying Margaret and Camille departed for Lord Weston's estate, Camille allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, confident that her plan had successfully removed her cousin from any opportunity to interfere with her own ambitions during the gathering. What Camille failed to anticipate, however, was that Lord Weston's gathering had been arranged with a specific purpose in mind, one orchestrated carefully by Alaric himself, who had specifically requested his old friend's assistance in creating an opportunity to formally address his intentions toward Alira in front of the very social circle that had so readily dismissed her. Upon arriving at Lord Weston's estate, Margaret and Camille were greeted warmly, ushered into a grand hall already filling with guests from various distinguished families. Camille scanned the crowd eagerly, searching for any sign of Alaric among the attendees, her heart quickening with anticipation at the thought of finally securing his attention without her cousin's interference. It did not take long for her to spot him, standing near the center of the hall, dressed in formal attire that clearly marked him as a guest of considerable importance. She made her way toward him immediately, offering her brightest smile. "Your Grace," she said, using his proper title for the first time, having learned the truth of his identity through Lord Weston's staff during earlier preparations for the gathering. "What a wonderful surprise to see you again." Alaric offered a polite but measured greeting, his gaze scanning the room briefly, as though searching for someone who was clearly absent. "Miss Whitmore," he said evenly, "I hope you're well." "Very well, thank you," Camille said, stepping closer. "I must admit, I was rather surprised to learn of your true title after your stay with us. You could have simply told us from the beginning." "I have my reasons for the discretion I choose," Alaric said, his tone carrying a subtle edge that Camille failed to fully register in her eagerness to capture his attention. "Tell me, is your cousin in attendance this evening?" Camille's smile faltered slightly at the unexpected question. "Alira? No, she remained home. Household matters required her attention." Something shifted in Alaric's expression, a flicker of concern quickly masked beneath practiced composure. "I see. Surely you don't need to concern yourself with household staff," Camille said quickly, attempting to redirect the conversation. "I imagine there are far more interesting matters to discuss this evening." Before Alaric could respond, Lord Weston approached, his expression carrying quiet purpose as he gently interrupted the exchange. "Alaric, might I borrow you for a moment? There's a matter I believe requires your immediate attention." Alaric excused himself from Camille's company, following Lord Weston toward a quieter corner of the hall, where the older man's expression had shifted to one of genuine concern. "I received word just before you arrived," Lord Weston said quietly. A letter delivered by one of the Whitmore household staff. It seems Alira has been forbidden from attending tonight, and worse, her correspondence with you has been discovered and condemned by her aunt. Alaric's jaw tightened with barely restrained anger. Condemned how? From what I understand, Margaret Whitmore believes Alira has entangled herself in some inappropriate secret affair, unaware of your true identity or intentions, Lord Weston explained. Camille appears to have orchestrated the discovery deliberately, likely out of jealousy. Alaric's expression darkened further, a rare display of open frustration crossing his usually composed features. "This ends tonight," he said firmly. "I won't allow Alira to suffer further humiliation because of her family's ignorance or her cousin's jealousy." "What do you intend to do?" Lord Weston asked. "I intend to correct this misunderstanding immediately and directly," Alaric said. "Will you assist me?" Lord Weston's expression carried quiet approval. "Of course. I've been waiting for this moment for quite some time." Together, the two men began making arrangements, setting into motion a plan that would ensure the truth of Alira's situation, and Alaric's genuine intentions toward her, would be revealed clearly and unmistakably, not only to the Whitmore family, but to the entire gathering of distinguished guests present that evening, finally putting an end to the secrecy and misunderstanding that had plagued their connection since the very beginning. Back at the Whitmore estate, Alira moved through her evening duties with a heavy heart, her mind consumed with worry over her unfinished letter to Alaric and uncertainty about whether Nora had managed to deliver it before the household's restrictions made further correspondence impossible. She had spent the day quietly completing her usual tasks, though her thoughts remained entirely elsewhere, replaying her aunt's harsh words and wondering how much longer she could bear the weight of a secret growing increasingly difficult to protect. As evening settled over the estate, Alira retreated to the small library, seeking quiet comfort among the familiar books that had offered her solace throughout so many difficult years within this household. She had barely settled into her usual chair when Nora appeared at the doorway, breathless and visibly anxious. "Miss Alira," Nora said urgently, "a carriage has just arrived. It's Lord Weston and he's asking for you directly." Alira's heart leapt with a confusing mixture of hope and dread. Lord Weston, here. But the gathering, surely he should still be there. "I don't know the details, miss," Nora said, "but he seems quite insistent that you come immediately." Alira rose quickly, smoothing her simple dress as best she could, and made her way toward the entrance hall, where Lord Weston stood waiting, his expression carrying a mixture of urgency and quiet reassurance. "Miss Hartwell," he said warmly as she approached, "forgive the unexpected intrusion, but I believe your presence is required at my estate this evening." "I don't understand," Alira said, confusion evident in her voice. "My aunt specifically forbade my attendance." "I'm aware," Lord Weston said gently, "but this matter extends beyond your aunt's wishes. Alaric has requested your presence directly, and given the circumstances that have unfolded this evening, I believe it's important you come with me now." "What circumstances?" Alira asked, worry creeping into her voice. "It's best explained upon arrival," Lord Weston said kindly. "Please trust me. I promise you this evening will resolve far more than it complicates." Alira hesitated only a moment before nodding, a strange sense of calm determination settling over her despite the uncertainty of what awaited. She had spent years accepting the restrictions placed upon her by others, quietly shrinking herself to avoid conflict. But something about Lord Weston's steady reassurance, combined with the knowledge that Alaric himself had requested her presence, gave her the courage to step beyond the boundaries her aunt had drawn. "Let me gather my shawl," she said, already moving toward the stairs. Within minutes, she settled into Lord Weston's carriage, her heart pounding with anticipation as the vehicle pulled away from the Whitmore estate, carrying her toward a destiny she could not yet fully comprehend. Meanwhile, at Lord Weston's estate, the gathering continued in full swing, guests mingling throughout the grand hall, unaware of the significant events about to unfold. Camille remained near Alaric whenever possible, though his attention had grown increasingly distant since his earlier conversation with Lord Weston, a fact that left her growing increasingly frustrated as the evening progressed. "Your Grace," Camille said, attempting once again to engage him in conversation, "I couldn't help but notice you seem distracted this evening. Is something troubling you?" "I'm simply awaiting an important arrival," Alaric said evenly, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the grand entrance. "An arrival?" Camille asked, curiosity evident in her voice. "Anyone I might know?" Before Alaric could respond, the doors to the grand hall opened, drawing the attention of nearby guests as Lord Weston entered, Alira following closely behind him, her simple gown standing in stark contrast to the elaborate finery worn by the other guests present. Camille's face drained of color the moment she spotted her cousin, disbelief and fury warring across her expression. What is she doing here? She was forbidden from attending. Alaric, however, felt something within his chest ease at the sight of Alira, relief and quiet determination settling over his features as he made his way directly toward her, ignoring the murmurs beginning to ripple through the surrounding guests. "Alira," he said warmly, taking her hand gently as he reached her. "Thank you for coming." Lord Weston explained very little, Alira admitted quietly, though her nervousness was tempered by the steady warmth in his expression. "I confess, I'm not entirely certain what's happening this evening." "Allow me to explain," Alaric said, turning to address the surrounding guests, whose attention had fully shifted toward the unfolding scene, conversations quieting as more people took notice. Margaret, who had been engaged in conversation across the room, hurried forward the moment she recognized her niece's presence, her expression carrying a mixture of shock and barely restrained anger. "Alira, what is the meaning of this? I explicitly forbade your attendance tonight." "Mrs. Whitmore," Alaric said calmly, though his tone carried unmistakable authority, "I take full responsibility for your niece's presence here this evening. I requested it directly." Margaret's expression shifted immediately, confusion replacing her anger as she registered the formal weight behind his words. "Your Grace, I don't understand. Why would you concern yourself with household matters involving my niece?" "Because your niece is not simply a household matter to me," Alaric said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent hall, every guest present turning their full attention toward the unfolding conversation. "She is someone I have come to hold in the highest regard, someone whose honesty, kindness, and quiet strength have made a greater impression on me than any social connection I've encountered in years." Gasps rippled through the crowd, guests exchanging astonished glances as the true nature of the situation began to dawn on them. Camille stood frozen near the edge of the gathering, her earlier satisfaction crumbling into horrified disbelief as she watched the scene unfold before her. "Your Grace," Margaret stammered, clearly struggling to process the implications of his words. "I had no idea, that is, we were unaware that the correspondence Alira received was from you directly." "I understand the confusion," Alaric said, his tone softening slightly as he addressed Margaret directly. "I chose discretion during my stay with your family for reasons of my own, reasons that unfortunately led to unnecessary suspicion and hardship for Alira. I regret that my choices contributed to the difficulties she's faced within your household because of it." Margaret's eyes darted toward Camille, understanding beginning to dawn as she pieced together her daughter's role in the situation. "Camille," she said slowly, "did you know about this?" Camille's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence entirely replaced by mounting panic. "Mother, I only wanted to protect this family's reputation." "By deceiving me about the nature of Alira's correspondence?" Margaret demanded, her voice rising with dawning realization and anger. "By ensuring she was forbidden from an event where the Duke himself specifically requested her presence." Camille had no response, her carefully constructed plan collapsing entirely under the weight of public exposure, every guest in the room now aware of her deliberate deception. Alaric, meanwhile, turned his full attention back toward Alira, gently taking her hand once more as he addressed the gathered crowd. I've spent years avoiding public displays of this nature, wary of the expectations and calculations that so often accompany noble courtship. But Alira has shown me that genuine connection matters more than any social convention or family ambition. I no longer wish to hide the depth of my regard for her. Alira felt tears welling in her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity of his words and the weight of the moment unfolding before the very people who had spent years dismissing her as unworthy of consideration. She glanced around the room, taking in the shocked expressions of guests who had, until moments ago, viewed her as nothing more than an overlooked niece. "I don't know what to say," she admitted softly, her voice trembling slightly. "You needn't say anything tonight," Alaric said gently, his expression carrying quiet warmth despite the public nature of their exchange. "I simply wanted the truth acknowledged, openly and honestly, without further secrecy or misunderstanding standing between us." Lord Weston stepped forward, addressing the gathered crowd with a measured, authoritative tone. "I believe we've all witnessed something rather remarkable this evening. Perhaps it would be wise to allow our guests a moment of privacy to properly discuss matters of such personal significance." The surrounding guests slowly resumed quiet conversation, though curious glances continued drifting toward Alira and Alaric as Lord Weston guided them toward a quieter side room, offering them the privacy needed to properly address the whirlwind of emotions and revelations that had unfolded within mere minutes. Once alone, Alira turned to face Alaric fully, her emotions finally breaking free from the composed restraint she had maintained throughout the public exchange. "You didn't have to do that," she said, though gratitude colored her voice more than reproach. "You've exposed yourself to considerable scrutiny on my behalf." "I would do far more than that for you," Alaric said sincerely. "I've watched you endure humiliation and dismissal for far too long, Alira. I refuse to allow that pattern to continue, especially not because of my own reluctance to publicly acknowledge my feelings." "Your family, your position," Alira began, though he gently interrupted her. "Will need to accept my choices, as I've already decided they must," he said firmly. "I've spent enough years allowing expectation and obligation to dictate my life. I won't allow it to dictate my heart as well." Alira felt the last of her carefully maintained composure crumble, tears finally spilling freely as relief, joy, and lingering disbelief washed over her simultaneously. "I don't know how to process everything that's happened tonight," she admitted. "You don't need to process it all at once," Alaric said gently, reaching up to brush away a tear from her cheek. "We have time now, Alira, real time without secrecy standing between us." She nodded, allowing herself, finally, to fully embrace the warmth and hope that had been building quietly within her heart for weeks, now finally free to exist openly, without fear of discovery or judgment clouding its growth. Outside the quiet room, the gathering continued, though the evening's events had irrevocably shifted the social landscape for the Whitmore family, setting into motion consequences that would unfold in the days and weeks to come. Consequences that would reshape not only Alira's future, but the entire dynamic of a household that had spent years overlooking her worth. News of the evening's events spread quickly through the region's social circles, carried from household to household with the particular speed reserved for stories involving nobility, secrecy, and public revelation. Within days, the Whitmore family found themselves at the center of conversation throughout every drawing room and dinner party in the district, though not in the manner Margaret had originally hoped for. Where she had once imagined Camille's name spoken alongside whispers of an advantageous match, instead it was Alira's name that circulated, accompanied by astonished admiration for the quiet niece who had captured the attention of the region's most reclusive and formidable duke. A man previously believed entirely unreachable by ordinary society. Camille found herself facing a dramatically different reception than she had anticipated. Rather than admiration for her efforts to secure Alaric's attention, she instead faced quiet judgment from her peers, whispers about her deliberate deception toward her own cousin circulating almost as quickly as the news of Alaric's public declaration. Invitations that had once arrived regularly began to slow. Families who had once eagerly sought connection with the Whitmores now approaching with visible caution, uncertain how to navigate a household suddenly at the center of such dramatic social upheaval. Margaret, faced with the reality of her daughter's actions and the potential damage to the family's reputation, found herself forced into a difficult reckoning. She summoned both Camille and Alira to the drawing room several days after the gathering, her expression carrying a weariness neither had seen from her before. "I've spent considerable time reflecting on recent events," Margaret said slowly, addressing both young women seated before her. "Camille, your actions toward your cousin were unacceptable. Deceiving me, orchestrating her exclusion from an event out of jealousy. These are not the actions of someone I raised to value honesty and family loyalty." Camille's eyes dropped to her lap, unable to meet her mother's disappointed gaze. "I only wanted what was best for this family." "You wanted what was best for yourself," Margaret said firmly. "And in doing so, you nearly cost this family any chance of maintaining respectable standing within our community. Had circumstances unfolded differently, had Alaric not chosen to address the matter so directly and publicly, the consequences could have been far worse." Alira remained quiet throughout the exchange, uncertain how to respond to her aunt's unexpected acknowledgement of the situation's true nature. "Alira," Margaret continued, turning her attention fully toward her niece, "I owe you an apology as well. I judged your correspondence unfairly, assumed the worst without giving you proper opportunity to explain, and enforced restrictions that ultimately caused you unnecessary distress. I was wrong to treat you with such suspicion." The words, though difficult for Margaret to voice, settled over Alira with unexpected weight. In all her years within this household, she had never once received a genuine apology from her aunt, had never been acknowledged as deserving of fair treatment rather than simple tolerance. "Thank you, Aunt Margaret," Alira said softly. "I appreciate you saying so." "I hope," Margaret continued, her tone carrying genuine sincerity, "that despite everything, you might consider forgiving this family's shortcomings, and perhaps, in time, allow us the opportunity to properly celebrate the remarkable connection you've formed." Alira studied her aunt carefully, weighing years of accumulated dismissal and hardship against this unexpected, genuine attempt at reconciliation. She thought of Alaric's words, his belief in the value of honesty and genuine connection over lingering resentment, and found herself softening despite the difficult history between them. "I don't hold grudges easily, Aunt Margaret," Alira said finally. "Though I hope, moving forward, this family might learn to see value in people regardless of their circumstances or standing." "A fair request," Margaret said, nodding solemnly, "one I intend to honor." Camille, still visibly humbled by the unfolding conversation, finally looked up, her expression carrying genuine remorse for perhaps the first time in the entire ordeal. "Alira, I'm sorry, truly. I let jealousy and fear cloud my judgment, and I hurt you because of it. I hope someday you might find it in yourself to forgive me as well." Alira considered her cousin's words carefully, recognizing the difficulty in offering such an admission after years of competitive tension between them. "I forgive you, Camille," she said finally. "Though I hope you understand that trust takes time to rebuild, especially after everything that's happened." "I understand," Camille said quietly. "I'll work to earn it back if you'll allow me the chance." The conversation marked a turning point within the household, the beginning of a slow, careful rebuilding of relationships long strained by years of unfair treatment and quiet resentment. Though the road toward genuine reconciliation remained long, the first steps had finally been taken, offering a glimpse of a future far different from the dynamic that had defined the household for so many years. In the weeks that followed, Alaric continued his correspondence with Alira, though now openly and without the burden of secrecy that had previously shadowed their connection. He visited the region again shortly after the gathering, this time with full transparency regarding his identity and intentions, spending considerable time with Alira as their relationship deepened beyond the careful boundaries they had previously maintained. During one such visit, as they walked together through the same garden where he had first confessed his true identity to her, Alaric paused near the fountain, turning to face her with an expression carrying both nervousness and quiet determination. "Alira," he said carefully, "I've spent considerable time reflecting on what I want for my future, and I find that every version of that future I imagine includes you at the center of it." Her heart quickened at the seriousness in his tone. "Alaric, what are you saying?" He reached into his coat, retrieving a small velvet box, his hand steady despite the evident weight of the moment. "I know our circumstances have been unconventional from the very beginning, filled with secrecy and complication neither of us anticipated. But throughout it all, one truth has remained constant: my admiration and affection for you, genuine and unwavering." He opened the box, revealing a simple yet elegant ring, its design carrying quiet sophistication rather than ostentatious display, a reflection of the genuine connection they shared rather than mere social obligation. "Alira Hartwell," he said softly, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled her eyes as she absorbed the weight of his words, memories flooding through her mind of every moment that had led them to this point. From that first quiet exchange on the terrace to the public declaration that had upended her household's dynamic entirely. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Alaric, I would be honored." He slipped the ring onto her finger, relief and joy evident in his expression as he pulled her into a gentle embrace, the quiet garden serving as witness to a moment neither of them would ever forget. News of their engagement spread quickly, though this time, the reception carried a markedly different tone than the initial shock following Alaric's public declaration. Guests who had once dismissed Alira as unworthy of consideration now offered genuine congratulations, eager to align themselves with a household about to enter into such a significant and respected connection. Margaret, though still adjusting to the dramatic shift in her family's social standing, embraced the engagement with genuine enthusiasm, eager to support Alira through the preparations ahead. Camille, true to her earlier promise, worked steadily to rebuild trust with her cousin, offering genuine assistance throughout the engagement preparations rather than the competitive tension that had once defined their relationship. As the wedding day approached, the household transformed once again, this time filled with genuine excitement rather than forced obligation, every member contributing toward creating a celebration worthy of the remarkable journey that had brought Alira and Alaric together. On the morning of the wedding, Alira stood before her mirror, dressed in an elegant gown far removed from the simple attire she had worn throughout most of her life within the Whitmore household. She studied her reflection quietly, marveling at the transformation not only in her circumstances, but in her own understanding of her worth, a transformation that had begun the moment a stranger in a dark coat had chosen to see her clearly, despite the mockery surrounding her that fateful evening months earlier. Camille entered quietly, dressed in her role as bridesmaid, her expression carrying genuine warmth as she took in her cousin's appearance. "You look beautiful, Alira, truly." "Thank you, Camille," Alira said softly, turning to face her cousin fully. "Thank you for everything you've done to help prepare for today." "It's the least I could do," Camille said, her voice carrying genuine sincerity. "After everything I put you through, helping celebrate your happiness feels like a small way to begin making amends." The two women shared a quiet, meaningful moment, the tension that had once defined their relationship finally giving way to genuine warmth and understanding, built slowly through the difficult months following that fateful public revelation. As Alira made her way toward the ceremony, she caught sight of Alaric waiting at the altar, his expression carrying quiet joy and anticipation as he watched her approach. She thought back to Camille's mocking words on that first evening, the humiliation that had once defined her place within her own family, and marveled at how far she had traveled from that moment of quiet suffering to this instant of pure, unguarded happiness. As she reached him, taking his hand for the ceremony that would formally bind their futures together. She allowed herself, finally, to fully release the years of quiet insecurity that had once defined her existence, embracing instead the genuine love and respect that had grown between them, built not on social convenience or calculated advantage, but on honest connection, patience, and mutual understanding. Their wedding marked not only the joining of two lives, but the quiet, powerful reminder that true worth could never be measured by title, wealth, or social standing, but rather by the genuine character revealed in how one treated others, especially those the world too often chose to overlook. In the months that followed the wedding, Alira settled into her new life as the duchess of a household far grander than anything she had known before, yet she never forgot the years of quiet struggle that had shaped her character long before she ever met Alaric. She insisted on maintaining close ties with the staff of her new household, treating every servant with the same warmth and respect she herself had once longed to receive, a quality that quickly earned her genuine affection throughout the estate. Alaric, watching his wife move through their new life with such natural grace and kindness, found himself falling more deeply in love with her each passing day, grateful daily for the courage it had taken both of them to defy expectation and pursue genuine happiness rather than convenient obligation. Margaret and Camille visited regularly, the relationship between the two households growing steadily warmer as trust rebuilt itself through consistent, genuine effort rather than empty promises. Camille, in particular, seemed transformed by the experience, having learned valuable lessons about jealousy, honesty, and the true cost of allowing insecurity to dictate one's actions toward those who deserved better treatment. She eventually found her own path toward happiness, forming a genuine connection with a kind gentleman from a neighboring estate, one built on mutual respect rather than calculated ambition, a relationship that flourished all the more because she had finally learned the value of authenticity over performance. Lord Weston remained a cherished friend to both Alira and Alaric, often visiting their estate to share stories and offer wisdom gathered through his years of quiet observation. He took particular pride in having played a small but meaningful role in bringing the couple together, often remarking with quiet satisfaction that some of life's most important connections form not through grand design, but through simple moments of genuine recognition between two people willing to see past surface appearances. As seasons passed, Alira often found herself reflecting on that fateful evening when Camille's mocking words had rung across a crowded ballroom, humiliation she had once believed would define her existence for years to come. She realized with quiet gratitude that the very moment meant to break her spirit had instead marked the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of her life, proof that dignity maintained through adversity often carried rewards far beyond what immediate circumstances might suggest. She began quietly mentoring young women within her new social circle who found themselves facing similar dismissal or unfair treatment within their own families, offering gentle guidance and genuine encouragement drawn from her own difficult journey. Her reputation grew not merely as a duchess of considerable standing, but as a woman of remarkable compassion and wisdom, someone who understood intimately the pain of being overlooked, and who used that understanding to uplift others rather than harbor bitterness. Alaric, too, found his own reputation shifting throughout the region. Where once he had been spoken of with cautious distance, a duke feared more than understood, he now found himself increasingly known for his genuine warmth and fairness, qualities that had always existed within him, but had rarely found space to flourish before Alira entered his life. Together, they transformed not only their own household, but gradually influenced the wider social expectations of their community, demonstrating through their example that genuine character mattered far more than inherited status or calculated social maneuvering. Years later, as their own children grew within the walls of their estate, Alira often told them the story of how their parents had met, careful to emphasize not the drama of public revelation or the eventual triumph over humiliation, but rather the quiet, steady value of kindness, patience, and honest connection. She wanted her children to understand that true worth came not from titles or wealth, but from character revealed in how one treated others, particularly those who seemed to have little to offer in return. Camille, now a frequent and welcome guest within their household, often joined these storytelling evenings, adding her own perspective on lessons learned through her earlier mistakes, using her own journey as a gentle reminder to the next generation about the dangers of allowing jealousy and insecurity to guide one's actions. Margaret, in her later years, often remarked with quiet pride on how far her family had traveled from those early days of misunderstanding and unfair treatment, grateful that circumstances had ultimately guided them toward genuine reconciliation rather than lasting estrangement. The story of the overlooked niece and the feared duke who had waited quietly behind her during her darkest moment of public humiliation became, in time, a story told throughout the region, not merely as an entertaining tale of romance and social triumph, but as a meaningful reminder that genuine worth often reveals itself most clearly in moments of adversity, and that those willing to look beyond surface appearances often discover connections far more valuable than anything social convention alone could ever provide. And so, the woman once mocked for being unmatched found not only a match worthy of her quiet strength and grace, but a partnership built on the very qualities that had once been used to diminish her, proving, in the end, that dignity, patience, and genuine kindness carried a value far greater than any title or fortune could ever measure.